Just 48 hours before a new trade deal between the US and the European Union is set to take effect, Donald Trump takes the stage and issues a threat. If the EU doesn't deliver the €750 billion it agreed to spend on American gas, oil, AI chips, and military equipment, he'll impose 35% tariffs on European exports. His words, they'll pay if they don't pay. But here's what most headlines miss. Europe isn't resisting, and it isn't complying either. It's rerouting. Quiet deals are unfolding, not in Washington, but in Beijing. While Trump pushes tariffs, Europe is pushing back quietly, ignoring US, just not in public. This isn't a rebellion. It's something far more strategic, and no one's talking about it. Welcome to Geo Capitalist, where we decode global wealth one power shift at a time. If this kind of analysis matters to you, hit that subscribe button. The world is changing faster than the headlines can follow. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on what could become the quiet collapse of the West's economic alliance. Let's get into it. It's not speculation, it's policy. In late July 2025, the US and EU signed a sweeping trade deal that slashes tariffs and deepens economic ties, at least on paper. The agreement lowers US tariffs on European goods from 30% to 15%, and in exchange, the EU committed to strategic purchases worth €750 billion in American energy, technology, and defense over the coming decade. But just days before the deal goes into effect, and as part of his 2026 campaign rhetoric, Donald Trump, now back on the campaign trail, delivers a warning. If the EU doesn't follow through, he'll hike tariffs to 35%. This wasn't buried in fine print. It aired live on CNBC. It's a gift, Trump said, referring to the deal. We can invest that in anything we want. If they don't pay, they'll pay. Brussels responded with silence. No statement, no protest. But behind closed doors, European leaders were furious. French and German officials privately called the ultimatum blackmail by design. European diplomats see the agreement not as a partnership, but as a debt contract under threat. Yet there's no appetite for confrontation. Instead, European leaders are quietly building insurance policies. New partners, alternative routes, and strategic alliances that bypass US dependency altogether. And the most visible shift is coming from Paris, where Macron isn't just shaking hands with Washington. He's shaking hands with Beijing. In public, President Emmanuel Macron speaks of climate diplomacy and green partnerships. In private, he's orchestrating one of the most strategic economic pivots France has made in decades, and China is at the center of it. Since 2023, Macron has made multiple visits to Beijing. But this isn't just symbolic statesmanship. It's deal-making. France has signed agreements with China across nuclear energy, artificial intelligence, and sustainable infrastructure, areas once dominated by US-EU collaboration. One agreement focuses on joint nuclear development for civil energy use, with French firm EDF now working with Chinese counterparts on advanced reactor tech. Another brings French AI labs into collaboration with Shenzhen-based partners, a move that raised eyebrows in Washington but barely made waves in Paris. France's pitch is clever. These are climate and technology partnerships, not geopolitical ones. But the strategic implication is obvious. By diversifying toward China, France gains leverage against American pressure. In fact, Macron has repeatedly stressed that Europe must not become just America's followers. That message now carries weight. France is hosting Chinese delegations in sectors from ports to digital finance, offering access and investment in exchange for independence. In return, Chinese firms are investing in French logistics and renewables, subtly reactivating the Belt and Road framework in Western Europe. This isn't a loud pivot. It's a quiet hedge, and Germany is doing the same, just with fewer headlines. Germany doesn't do trade diplomacy on TV. It does it through contracts, exports, and factories. And while Berlin remains publicly committed to the transatlantic relationship, its industrial base tells a different story, one rooted increasingly in East Asia. In 2024, Germany's exports to China reached new highs, despite mounting U.S. pressure to decouple. Why? Because China remains Germany's largest trading partner, and German firms are doubling down. Take Volkswagen, which signed a $2.5 billion deal for battery production in Anhui. Or BASF, launching its largest ever overseas project, a chemical production hub in Zhanjiang, China. These aren't backup plans, they're core investments. Meanwhile, German chip makers are bypassing U.S. restrictions by forming joint ventures with South Korean and Japanese partners. These ventures let them maintain access to Chinese markets without triggering U.S. export controls. Berlin's official 2024 China strategy calls for risk reduction, not disengagement. But in practice, German firms are expanding, not reducing, their Asia exposure. And government policy isn't stopping them. In fact, subsidies and trade facilitation measures suggest quiet approval. Germany knows that American policy can shift every 4 years. China, for all its complexities, offers stability. For a country where exports drive over 47% of GDP, that matters. What's emerging is not a betrayal of the U.S. It's a parallel track. One where Berlin can say the right things diplomatically, while its corporations follow the money. And the numbers prove it. Let's zoom out. Step back from press conferences and election headlines and look at the numbers. In 2024, trade between the European Union and China surpassed €700 billion, solidifying China's place as the EU's largest trading partner in goods. And that's just the surface. At the core is a quietly expanding infrastructure. The China-Europe Railway Express, once a symbolic Belt and Road project, has become a vital corridor. In 2023, over 16,000 freight trains traveled from Xi'an to Rotterdam, delivering machinery, electronics, and raw materials in under 20 days, a direct alternative to maritime and air freight, especially for German and Dutch exporters. European ports have adapted. Duisburg in Germany, Valencia in Spain, and Piraeus in Greece are all linked to Chinese logistics systems. These are no longer test runs. They're pipelines. Digital links are growing too. Payment platforms like Alipay and UnionPay are now accepted across EU retail hubs. Even with Huawei excluded from some Western telecom networks, its core infrastructure still powers segments of Europe's 5G build-outs, especially in Southern and Eastern Europe. And while the US ramps up restrictions and tariffs, China is doing the opposite. Lowering barriers, expanding routes, and offering long-term infrastructure deals. For European businesses and governments, this isn't a moral question. It's an operational one. The EU isn't replacing America, it's buffering against it. That's what happens when trust erodes. And that's exactly what has happened over the last decade. Trust is rarely lost in a single moment. It's eroded by a series of broken expectations. For Europe, that erosion began years ago. From Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate, agreement to the collapse of TTIP, and more recently, the CHIPS Act, which effectively excluded EU firms from billions in US subsidies. Washington's message has been clear: America first, even at the expense of its allies. Now, with the July 2025 trade deal, Europe has agreed to buy €750 billion worth of US gas, oil, AI chips, and military equipment, but under thinly veiled threat. Trump called it a gift to America and warned that if Europe fails to deliver, tariffs will jump to 35%. To European leaders, this feels less like diplomacy and more like transactional pressure. French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire stated it bluntly last year. The United States has embraced economic nationalism. Europe must respond with strategic autonomy. That phrase, once academic, is now EU policy. The EU is building its own defense fund, expanding digital sovereignty laws, and seeking energy independence, not just from Russia, but also from US LNG dependency. Many in Brussels view the new US-EU trade deal not as a win, but as a test. If America's leadership changes again in 2028, what will be left of this pact? Europe is preparing for instability as the new normal in Washington. And when you prepare for instability, you diversify. So how is the US responding? With more restrictions and even more isolation. In Washington, the narrative is one of strength. Tariffs create leverage. But in practice, the new trade architecture is starting to look like a fortress. Starting August 7th, the U.S. will impose a 10% general tariff on nearly all imports and an even steeper 50% tariff on steel and aluminum, unless countries have individually renegotiated with Washington. The July agreement with the EU does temporarily lower U.S. tariffs on European goods from 30% to 15%, but it comes with heavy strings attached, including the €750 billion commitment and zero reciprocal tariffs from Europe. Countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand have scrambled to strike last-minute deals, gaining exemptions. But others, Ecuador, Turkey, New Zealand, and Bolivia, are being hit harder, facing tariff hikes with no recourse. Meanwhile, the Inflation Reduction Act continues to sideline European firms, channeling subsidies only to US-based green tech producers. The export controls on semiconductors have blocked some European chipmakers from accessing global supply chains. This isn't multilateralism, it's economic nationalism with conditions. And Europe is taking notes. China, in contrast, is offering stability, consistent trade terms, infrastructure partnerships, and bilateral agreements tailored to EU member states. While the US builds policy walls, China builds logistics corridors, and Europe is using them. What Washington sees as pressure, Brussels increasingly sees as an expiration date on transatlantic loyalty. Some EU states aren't even waiting for Brussels. They're already acting. Let's look at who's benefiting quietly. It's not just France and Germany shaping Europe's pivot. It's the quiet players on the periphery who are accelerating it. Countries like Hungary, Serbia, and Italy have become test cases for what post-US alignment looks like inside Europe. In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orban has welcomed Chinese investment with open arms. The Chinese battery giant CATL is building one of Europe's largest EV battery plants there. Huawei maintains its European headquarters in Budapest. And a Chinese-financed rail line now connects Budapest to Belgrade, part of the Belt and Road reboot. No longer branded, but fully operational. Serbia, while not an EU member, has signed energy and infrastructure pacts with China that eclipse its trade with Brussels. And Italy, despite formally exiting the Belt and Road Initiative in 2023, has maintained key port and rail partnerships with Chinese firms, especially around Naples and Genoa. Even Greece, once seen as an economic weak link, now operates one of the Mediterranean's busiest ports, Piraeus, under partial Chinese ownership. It's quietly become a gateway for Chinese goods into southern Europe. These moves aren't rogue, they're rational. Smaller states see an opportunity. While the EU and US posture, China is offering concrete deals: ports, rails, factories. This isn't just diversification, it's realignment in stages. And that brings us to the final point. This isn't a collapse, it's a separation, slow, quiet, and strategic. There will be no grand announcement, no flags lowered. But behind the smiles and summit photos, Europe and the US are drifting apart, not in ideology, but in economics. What once defined the transatlantic relationship, shared trade priorities, mutual trust, synchronized policy, is now being replaced by independent hedging and contingency planning. The EU still calls the US a strategic ally, but it no longer behaves like a dependent one. France is signing tech deals in Beijing. Germany is betting on China to stabilize its export economy. And smaller states are finding room to maneuver, not within NATO, but between the cracks of shifting global alliances. Meanwhile, the US is becoming more transactional, more unilateral, and more unpredictable. What was once leadership now feels to many in Europe like pressure and penalties. The result isn't rebellion, it's replacement. One silent step at a time, and the world is watching. If you found this breakdown valuable, watch our next video. It connects directly to what's unfolding. And don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us decode these global shifts without compromise. Let us know in the comments. Is Europe really going rogue or simply moving on? This was Why Europe is Quietly Ignoring the US and No One's Talking About It. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.